Hello and welcome to Flip Video 31. We're going to cover the battle in the Pacific, the war in Tennessee, and what happened after the war. So we've got a lot of information and 15 minutes to do it. So let's start with the battles in the Pacific. Okay, so after they attacked Pearl Harbor, the Japanese knew they had to move fast, okay? They had done a really good blow to Hawaii and Pearl Harbor, but there was all those ships that were off the coast, all right? So they hurried up and they took Guam, Wake Island, and Hong Kong, okay? So these are all American held, but they moved so quick that we ended up surrendering them. And the final battle was on the Baton Peninsula where the U.S. surrendered the Philippines. All right, so they got all the way to the Philippines. And when they took the Philippines, they had the Baton Death March. Now, I mentioned to you that they were marching people, okay, and it was horrible. Well, here's one of those marches, okay? So the POWs, which are prisoners of war who were sick and malnourished, were forced to walk 60 miles inland. This march was so big, 7,000 died on the way. So they were sick, they were hungry, and they just took them. And they continued to take islands until they reached right next to Australia. So the next is Midway. U.S. has got to start fighting back, okay? And so the U.S. starts on Midway Island. So American naval base in the Central Pacific. If America lost Midway, they would be forced to retreat back to California, okay? So this is really, really important. In Hawaii, we had Pearl Harbor, and that was a major base for us. Now, one of the whole reasons why we got involved in the Spanish-American War mess in the first place is because we wanted islands in the Pacific, so we had a military stronghold. Well, Japan is coming in and they're starting to take those islands back, right? So we've lost Guam, we've lost Wake Island, we've lost the Philippines, these major holds. So now we're fighting to keep Midway, okay? And if we lose Midway, we don't have a hold in the Pacific, okay? So Admiral Nimitz knew of Yamamoto's plans. All right, and so because of U.S. code breakers, and we talked about those code breakers yesterday, like the Navajo code breakers, they were able to figure stuff out, all right? So he brought all the available carriers back to Midway, okay? The Japanese fleet was already stretched over thousands of miles because they're taking over all these different islands, all right? On June 4th, 1942, the U.S. dealt Japan a decisive defeat, and Midway was the turning point of the war in the Pacific. So you have Stalingrad in the European theater and Midway in the Pacific. Then we have Iwo Jima and Okinawa. General Douglas MacArthur began an island-hopping campaign, taking over the Japanese-held islands on the way to Japan. All right, so he first got Midway, and then he kept going. All right, each island was a hard-fought battle. This is why you have those games, the World War II games on islands, all right? Because these were bloody, brutal battles. You know, the Japanese, they had that pride, all right? They don't want to lose, all right? They would often commit suicide if they lost. So these battles were going to be literally to the death, all right? So Iwo Jima was the fiercest battle, 36 days, so over a month of fighting and 23,000 Marine casualties, okay? Thousands died, and the Allies did win the battle. Okinawa, even more deadly, okay? It contained a vital air base they needed for the attack on Japan. It took 500,000 troops and 1,213 warships, all right? But the U.S. forces won at the cost of 50,000 casualties. So we more than doubled our casualties in Okinawa from Iwo Jima. Once Okinawa was taken, the U.S. began to bomb Japan. And then that's when we start getting ready to make that choice to drop the big bombs on Japan. So here's your map so you get an idea. Okay, so Pearl Harbor is right here. Okay, here is Japan. Okay, oh, wait, here's Japan, there's the Philippines, forgive me. So here's Midway. We lose Pearl Harbor, we win Midway, we take Wake Island back, but here's Iwo Jima and Okinawa. All right, so see how close we are getting to Japan to be able to launch our planes into Japan? All right. Now, the war in Tennessee, okay? Most of you are probably thinking, wait a minute. There's not a war in Tennessee. The war was fought in different countries. Well, we played a part. So the Manhattan Project, it was based in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. All right, home of the uranium enrichment plants K25 and Y12, the liquid thermal diffusion plant S50, and the pilot plutonium production reactor X10. Okay, the town was built to accommodate 30,000 workers and the plants. It also housed the Manhattan District Engineer headquarters. So this is a really big deal that it's all focused right there in Oak Ridge. All right, by the end of the war, it was the 5th largest city in Tennessee. Okay, this is a man-made city that they built really, really fast, and it grew. Okay, so the appeal of Oak Ridge was Knoxville. Okay, Knoxville's really close to them, and it was far enough away from anything to contain any accidents. Okay, so still is pretty isolated, but it's, you can, forgive me, you can see there's a safe distance. All right, so the residents of Knoxville did not like the Oak Ridge workers. All right. The Oak Ridge workers, they're not allowed to talk about what they're doing, okay? So they come off as standoffish. I mean, this Knoxville, it may be a bigger town, but it's still small enough where people are wanting to know what's going on, okay? But also, they got unlimited rations, okay? If you worked for the Manhattan Project, you can get whatever you wanted. Well, during the war, we're rationing food out, so you can only have so much. And so that upset people as well. All right, and then we have Oak Ridge after the war. So in 1946, an X-10 began producing peacetime radioisotopes to use in agriculture, medicine, industry, and research. X-10 shut down for good in 1963. K-25 produced fuel for civilian nuclear plants in 1985. And we'll look more into these, but basically the point is Oak Ridge is still functioning, okay? They're still doing things with these plants. And we're going to look at the secret site of the atomic bomb from Aerial America in class. Well, we talked about the internment camps for the Japanese. Well, we've had some internment camps right here in Tennessee. Okay, we have Camp Forest in Tullahoma. It's the largest U.S. Army training facility. It also was the first internment camp in the nation. Okay, from January to November in 1942, it housed civilians, and in 1943, it housed POWs. Okay, so it was Americans of German and Italian heritage who were arrested as enemy aliens. Okay, so we study the Japanese internment camps on the West Coast, but we housed anybody that we thought was a threat here in Tennessee. So Germans and Americans. Okay, they later housed the prisoners of war, so they actually brought German and Italians from Europe to Tennessee to be housed. And they ended up housing a total of 24,000 prisoners. There was another one located at Fort Campbell on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. It housed about 4,000 German prisoners. Again, these are guys that are taken from Europe and brought here as prisoners of war. You don't really think about that. It's kind of a crazy idea. One of the 142 German POW camps in the United States. So we had a bunch. All right. There were 3 separate camps there, and they were designed to house only 1,000 prisoners. They ended up housing a lot more. Many prisoners were available to hire out locally and help balance the shortfall of labor with the men off to war. So there was a benefit because they were able to replace those men at war. So if you look at this picture up here, this is German POWs helping out local farmers. So what happened after World War II? All right, we've studied how we dropped the bombs. We've studied how we kind of choked off Germany and they surrendered. What happened afterwards? Let's start with the Yalta Conference, okay? Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at Yalta in the Black Sea in February of 1945. So the big 3, here they are. All right, the war is still going on, but the Allies knew they needed a post-war plan to deal with Germany, Eastern Europe, and Asia. Okay, so these guys are like, we need to get together before the war gets over. So we have a plan when it does end. They agreed Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania would hold free elections. Stalin later changed his mind on this. All right, and you'll see that later on. And they agreed on a new peacekeeping organization, the United Nations, which is still alive today. All right, so the United Nations started at the Yalta Conference. Well, when the war ended, they had the Potsdam Conference, and the big three had changed. All right, we have Stalin, Truman, and Attlee. All right, so different president of United States and different prime minister of Great Britain. Okay, so in July of 1945, in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam, they agreed that Truman was more focused on Europe. Okay, so Truman's like, look, we dealt with Japan. Okay, we don't need to worry so much of the Soviet Union. Let's deal with what's going on in Europe. What are we going to do with Germany? Okay, Truman also didn't trust Stalin as much as Roosevelt did. All right, so Truman saw kind of what Stalin did. All right, so he was like, I don't really think we need to trust these guys. They're communists. All right, so they assigned occupation zones in Germany. Okay, so if you look up here, you're going to see the map. There's 4 zones of occupation. Okay, America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. All right, so America, Britain, and France are on this side. Soviet Union's over here. Okay, Berlin, right in the middle of it. And they divvied up Berlin as well. Okay, they agreed on new borders and free elections for Poland. And Russia would be able to collect reparations from the sector of Germany that they controlled. Okay, so on this side of Berlin and this side of Germany, Russia could take reparations for the damages that they incurred. They also have the United Nations, okay? The United States led the charge for the United Nations. So once again, we're the ones coming up with the idea of this peacekeeping group. But this one is actually going to stick because our presidents, Eisenhower and Roosevelt, decided that, you know what, let's go ahead and actually talk to our people so that when we go and propose this United Nations, it'll stick. So they hope it would succeed where the League of Nations did not. In April 1945, 50 nations met in San Francisco to write the charter. So the nations got together to do it. Okay, the Senate overwhelmingly ratified the charter. Why? Because Eisenhower talked to the people. Okay, and later the UN would set up their home in New York City. The goal of the UN was to prevent further world wars or events such as the Holocaust. Okay, so their main goal is to keep the peace. So Cordell Hull is an important figure. Okay, he's the Secretary of State under FDR. He's a native of Tennessee, and he drafted the blueprint for what would become the UN. All right, so he worked with a bipartisan committee. Again, this is why it worked where the League of Nations didn't. Okay, FDR nominated Hull for the Nobel Peace Prize. Okay, so this is before he passed away, he nominated him, and Hull did win that Peace Prize. And here's how it works. It's an organized on cooperation of the participating powers and not equality, okay? So where the League of Nations was everybody is equal, one person goes to war, everybody goes to war, now they're organizing it a little bit differently. So all members sit on the General Assembly, everybody's part of that. But the 5 major World War II allies are given permanent seats on the Security Council, okay? So we got US, Britain, France, China, Soviet Union, all right? And it is the most powerful arm of the UN. And then they rotate out the other seats of the Security Council. Truman selected Eleanor Roosevelt to be the U.S. representative. So this is a really big deal. Our first U.S. representative to the UN is a woman, and it's Eleanor Roosevelt. And she guided the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is essentially the guiding document that runs the UN. All right, and it defined rights that belong to all people in the world. All right, well, that is it for World War II. I hope you enjoyed it.